If you've ever felt like you see things others don't, if you've experienced flashes of knowing that you can't quite explain, or if you found yourself living more in your inner world than the external one, you might recognize yourself in what I'm about to share with you. Carl Jung identified a psychological type that stands apart from all others, not just because it's rare, but because of the profound complexity it carries within. He called it the intuitive introvert. And if you are one, you already know how challenging it can be to navigate a world that doesn't quite understand how your mind works. You see, if you're this type, you don't operate from the same starting point as most people. While others focus on external action, concrete facts, or visible emotions, you're connected to something entirely different, a symbolic flow that emerges from deep within your unconscious. You're guided by inner images, premonitions, and archetypal patterns that most people simply can't perceive. Your compass isn't external logic or what you can observe with your senses. Instead, you navigate by an internal knowing. You capture meanings before they're fully formed. You sense psychological shifts before they become conscious in others, and you're deeply sensitive to the invisible currents that run beneath the surface of everyday life. I want you to understand something important. The concrete world, with all its practical demands and rational explanations, might often feel irrelevant to you. This isn't because you're arrogant or disconnected. It's because your attention is naturally directed toward another dimension entirely. You operate on a symbolic plane that often runs ahead of present time. For you, the facts that others fixate on are just shadows of something far more essential that's still taking shape. Jung described your type as someone who perceives what's about to unfold, but hasn't yet materialized. Your perception is oriented toward potential, toward what's forming in the collective unconscious before it becomes visible to the rest of the world. This makes you incredibly sensitive to cultural, spiritual, and existential transformations that are announcing themselves long before others notice them. But here's what you probably already know all too well. This extraordinary sensitivity comes with a price. The world around you doesn't operate on your frequency. Society demands proof, results, concrete data, and what you perceive is, by its very nature, intangible, at least initially. This creates a painful gap between what you see internally and what the world expects from you. Your perceptions are often dismissed, ridiculed, or even pathologized. You're the person who intuits something essential about someone you've just met, who feels shifts in the atmosphere before events unfold, who senses outcomes long before the facts confirm them. But when you try to share these insights, you're usually met with silence or rejection. Over time, you've probably learned to stay quiet, to keep your inner world private and protected. And this is exactly where the real danger begins. Jung left us a crucial warning. When you don't find ways to translate your visions into language, art, or concrete action, you risk being consumed by them entirely. Your inner world, which should be a source of revelation and insight, can become a prison. Those symbolic images that visit you, when they're not integrated into your conscious awareness, begin to dominate your psyche with their own autonomous force. You stop being the one who contemplates these visions and become the one who is possessed by them. This is where Jung's most serious warning takes shape. Your gift of deep intuition, if it's not properly balanced, can transform into a process of dissociation. But I want you to know that this journey, while not easy, carries immense transformative potential when you find your path of expression and integration. You're on a journey between worlds, and understanding this crossing can illuminate not just your own experience, but the deeper mysteries of what it means to be human. Let me help you understand how your mind actually works. In Jung's system, intuition is what he called an irrational function, a form of perception that doesn't rely on logic or what your senses tell you. But in your case, as an introverted intuitive, This function turns completely inward, diving deep into your unconscious. Unlike extroverted intuition, which seeks possibilities in the outer world, your intuition turns toward the depths of your own psyche. You don't capture what's visible, you perceive what emerges from the more ancient, symbolic layers of your mind, often without warning, context, or immediate explanation. Jung described your function as the ability to perceive raw psychic images, symbolic forms that haven't yet been transformed into thoughts, feelings, or actions. You live in constant contact with these images. You don't see with your physical eyes. You see with what Jung called the eyes of the soul. What appears as an ordinary situation to others carries hidden meanings for you. Invisible tensions, patterns that repeat silently beneath the surface. Your mind operates like an antenna turned inward, picking up signals that have no words but possess weight, form, and psychic energy. When this sensitivity is integrated properly, it becomes a powerful source of insight. You're capable of perceiving the deep meaning behind events, understanding the unconscious motivations of others, and anticipating changes before they become visible to anyone else. But here's the challenge you face. This same sensitivity makes you vulnerable to internal dispersion. Your sensation function, the one responsible for keeping you connected to the present moment and your physical body, is often your least developed aspect. You can easily drift away from objective reality. When this happens, your intuition begins to function on its own, disconnected from practical experience, and you can get lost in an ocean of internal images. This inner landscape isn't chaotic, but it's also not something you can control. Symbolic images arise from psychic necessity, not from your conscious choice. When these visions are well directed, they can become seeds of creation, transformative ideas, healing symbols, and revelatory narratives. But if you don't understand and process them, they accumulate as psychic noise, leading to confusion, paralysis, and the breakdown of your rational thinking. You begin to live, not in the world, but in a kind of self-reinforcing parallel reality. If you recognize yourself in this description, understanding how your own intuition works is your first step toward freedom. You need to learn to distinguish between symbols that reveal truth and fantasies that have no foundation. This requires time, silence, and internal structure. But it also requires a warning. No matter how fascinating your internal world may be, it contains traps. Your intuition has a characteristic that makes it both fascinating and dangerous. It doesn't operate in present time. Its nature is directed toward what's coming, toward what doesn't yet exist, but hints at itself at the edges of consciousness. You live as if you're inhabiting the threshold between now and not yet. You sense the approach of events. You perceive archetypal changes in the psychic and cultural fabric before they manifest in concrete form. This capacity for anticipation makes you what Jung called prophet-like, someone who sees what others cannot yet see. But there's a fundamental dilemma in this position. What you see cannot be proven. What you feel cannot be justified with facts, and what you intuit rarely finds resonance in others. This creates a constant conflict between the inner clarity of your vision and the lack of external recognition. You begin to doubt yourself, or you take refuge in your perceptions with such absolute conviction that you reject the world around you. In both cases, the tension between the invisible you perceive and the visible you deny begins to corrode your psyche. Jung shared a powerful example of how this works. He described a patient who, during analysis, saw an image of a black snake lodged in her abdomen. As treatment progressed, this snake began to rise within her body until it emerged from her mouth and transformed into a serpent with a golden head. To most people, this would seem like delusional fantasy. But Jung interpreted the image as a clear symbol of inner transformation, a process of individuation taking visual form through the unconscious. The black snake represented repressed content, that when integrated was reborn as a symbol of healing. This example perfectly illustrates how your introverted intuition functions. It doesn't speak with logic, it speaks with images. It doesn't point to causes, it reveals destinies. The problem arises when these images don't find an external language, when the symbol isn't translated into creation, reflection, or action. At this point, your vision, which was once revealing, begins to close in on itself. Your mind loses the ability to distinguish insight from illusion, and what was symbolic wisdom becomes solitary delusion. The boundary between revelation and delusion is extremely subtle, and as an introverted intuitive, you walk on this edge every day. For your intuition not to become a psychic labyrinth, you need to understand the mechanisms that can lead to a complete break with reality. You are by nature a solitary individual, not by preference, but by psychic structure. Your attention is directed toward what cannot be seen, toward what hasn't yet taken shape, toward what emerges from the unconscious in symbols, visions, and premonitions. However, when this inner orientation doesn't find a means of expression or connection with the external world, it creates fertile ground for identity crisis and, in extreme cases, delusions of grandeur. Jung called this process inflatio, the moment when your ego becomes inflated by unconscious contents and you begin to identify with powerful archetypes without recognizing your limits. This happens subtly. Because you perceive deep symbolic patterns, you may begin to believe that you've been chosen for a special mission. This sense of uniqueness, although initially legitimate as a reflection of your sensitivity, can transform into messianic illusion. You start to see yourself as a bearer of absolute truths, an unrecognized visionary, a prophet rejected by a blind society. Criticism from others becomes persecution in your mind, and doubt is seen as a sign of others' inferiority. Your isolation deepens, not as a consequence, but as a justification. No one understands me because I'm more evolved. This type of psychic inflation is dangerous because it dissolves your self-criticism. You begin to live within your own symbolic narrative, with no clear distinction between archetypal content and concrete reality. You identify with images from the unconscious, the wise one, the martyr, the prophet, and lose contact with your ordinary humanity. This over-identification with archetypes leads to psychic fragmentation. Your intuitive function, which once offered glimpses of meaning, transforms into a vehicle of escape. You neglect practical life. Relationships become merely instrumental, and any contradiction is rejected as a threat to your inner vision. Jung observed that this pattern was common in personalities that emotionally isolated themselves and resisted any form of adaptation to the world. The greater danger, he said, wasn't the isolation itself, but what came afterward, the complete colonization of consciousness by the unconscious. When this happens, your ego stops mediating reality and becomes merely a passive receptacle of symbolic images. Your perception becomes distorted, your judgment contaminated, and your existence begins to move in a subtly delirious fantasy realm where everything seems to make sense, but nothing is rooted in the real. But here's what you need to know. Not every contact with symbols leads to collapse. There is an antidote, and it begins with your capacity for expression, your ability to translate the invisible into form, word, gesture, or art. When your symbolic vision finds a way to exit your private sphere and manifest in the world, it transforms from prison into creation. History is full of figures who likely operated from your intuitive, introverted function and managed to channel their visions into works that altered collective consciousness. Think of Franz Kafka, with his labyrinthine and dreamlike texts, channeling his symbolic alienation into works that still capture the absurdity of modern existence. Consider Vincent van Gogh, unable to adapt to the practical world, pouring his emotional and symbolic vision into explosive brushstrokes, each painting a desperate attempt to translate a soul on fire. Even Jung himself, who recognized this type in himself, wrote his deepest works as attempts to translate complex internal experiences into comprehensible systems. But this isn't just about genius or talent. What these examples show you is that symbolic expression is the bridge between your inner world and the outer world. When this bridge doesn't exist, symbols accumulate, close in on themselves, and begin to distort your perception of reality. But when there's a way out, your inner images become work, gesture, and word, and this reorganizes your psyche. Your intuitive function stops operating in the dark and begins to collaborate with consciousness. Creativity then becomes not just a gift, but a process of psychological integration. Your psychic survival largely depends on your ability to transform the invisible into form. For Jung, unexpressed symbols tend to become autonomous agents within your psyche, acting like foreign bodies that haven't been digested by consciousness. The only way to integrate these internal images is by giving them shape in the external world. Symbolic expression, whether through art, writing, music, or rituals, isn't an aesthetic luxury for you. It's a vital necessity. This process of translating symbols into reality is what differentiates the creative visionary from the fragmented mystic. When you find a way to externalize your perceptions, you transform your symbolic solitude into communication, your strangeness into language, and your isolation into impact. What was an internal labyrinth becomes a shareable map. This act of creation has a dual effect. It not only relieves your internal psychic tension, but also offers the collective access to contents that were previously only in the unconscious. However, even the richest symbolic expression may not be enough if you're not rooted in reality. By your very structure, you tend to neglect your body, routine, and concrete limits. This exposes you to new risks. Creation can become compulsion, and inspiration can turn into escape. True integration only happens when your symbols also find a sensory foundation, when your intuition is balanced by sensation. Your intuitive function operates outside of time, body, and linearity. It dives into the unconscious, gathers symbols and premonitions, and returns carrying visions that don't belong to the concrete world. This ability gives you your enigmatic brilliance, but it's also what can weaken you. Without an anchor, without a solid foundation in the present, your intuition risks becoming a whirlpool. That's why Jung emphasized the importance of integrating your inferior function. Sensation. Sensation is the function responsible for keeping you connected to the now, to your body, to the material world. It perceives what's tangible, the warmth of sun on skin, the bitter taste of coffee, the weight of an object in your hands. For you, as an introverted intuitive who tends to neglect these perceptions as mundane or irrelevant, sensation might seem like a foreign language. But it's precisely this language that can provide the antidote to excessive abstraction. You can find balance in the materiality of simple things, in walking, cooking, tending to plants, practicing a manual craft, or simply maintaining a routine. Your return to the body, to routine, and to present time doesn't deny your symbolic depth. It sustains it. When you manage to alternate between intuitive diving and concrete practice, your visions stop being labyrinths and become roots. You become capable of moving between worlds, the internal and external, the invisible and tangible. This transit is what characterizes true psychic maturity. Your symbols then stop being objects of passive contemplation and transform into real guiding forces that shape your life decisions and relationships, not as oracles, but as compasses. Everyday rituals take on a therapeutic function in this context. They don't need to be grand or esoteric. They can be as simple as lighting a candle at dawn, writing in a notebook at day's end, or intentionally organizing your workspace. These small acts create an axis in your internal chaos. They're gestures that tell your unconscious, there is order, there is body, there is reality. It's in this ritualized space that symbols can descend to earth without exploding your psyche. The integration of sensation isn't a limitation, it's what allows your intuition to flourish more powerfully. But even when you develop symbolic expression and anchoring practices, you face a final challenge: living your truth in a world that generally rejects everything that cannot be measured, explained, or monetized. How do you sustain your vision in an environment dominated by logic, productivity, and immediacy? How do you continue listening to internal symbols when the external world demands obedience to the concrete? Even when you develop means of symbolic expression and build practices of anchoring in reality, you still face an obstacle that few perceive, and which may be the hardest of all: sustaining your own inner truth in a world that systematically rejects the invisible. Modern culture, focused on the concrete, immediate and measurable, values objective results, statistical data, productivity, and visible performance. Your deep intuitions, symbolic visions, and silent reflections are not only ignored, they're often ridiculed, pathologized, or dismissed as irrelevant. This creates constant tension between fidelity to your own soul and the need to adapt. At every moment, you find yourself faced with a choice: betray your inner vision to fit into collective discourse, or remain true to yourself, even if it means marginalization, misunderstanding, and loneliness. This choice isn't theoretical. It presents itself in the details of everyday life, in conversations where you need to silence what you truly think, in environments where your quiet nature is interpreted as weakness, in jobs where you cannot express what you see, feel, or sense under threat of being considered inappropriate. But this tension doesn't have to lead to resignation. Jung argued that the process of individuation requires exactly this: sustaining the symbolic core of yourself, even amid the opposing forces of collectivity. Living your symbolic truth isn't withdrawing from the world, it's navigating through it without losing your internal axis. It's knowing that the vision you carry may never be fully recognized, yet still needs to be lived. Because in the end, the function of your intuition isn't to please, convince, or win. It's to point to paths that don't yet exist. Living symbolically in a materialistic society is a silent act of resistance. It's choosing depth over appearance, meaning over convenience. It's sustaining a connection with the invisible, even when everything around you says it has no value. But when you find the courage to remain true to what you see, you become a transformative figure, not by imposing yourself on the world, but by revealing through your presence that there's something beyond the surface. And this revelation, no matter how subtle, has the power to touch, disturb, and inspire those who are ready to perceive. If you feel that you belong to this invisible world, if you live among symbols, intuitions, and premonitions that few understand, I want to hear from you. Share in the comments how you've dealt with this crossing between worlds. What strategies have you found to remain whole? How do you balance your inner world with external reality? Your response may help others who live the same silent dilemma, because in the end, we're all trying to find our way between the world of symbols and the world of facts, between the invisible truths we carry and the visible life we must navigate.